Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generations. Heck, my name is Alan. There's nothing better than Star Wars during the holiday season. Something warm and toasty to get you from Thanksgiving to Christmas and Hanukkah into the new year. Awesome. And this year we're going to get something that no one asked for, Skeleton Crew, and with expectations almost non-existent for this show, which I think is a great thing because hopefully this will mean that there will be less drama and we can just focus on the show and the lore that surrounds it, of course. Plus, I have a feeling that this is going to be one of those, it looks like it's for kids kind of show, but it's really just for the parents who are chasing some nostalgic past that probably never existed, or existed in Amblin films we watched growing up. As much as I'd like to think that my childhood was like the Goonies, it totally wasn't. It was more like a mixture of Castaway with X-Men, except none of the kids were gifted. As a matter of fact, many of us had weaknesses like asthma and peanut allergies. Plus, it was a public school, so there were no cool uniforms. But keying in on those human emotions, the nostalgia of a shared childhood that most of us didn't have, is overall a really strong move, I think, from a marketing point of view. I mean, if this show is even half as good as Stranger Things, I'll be happy. Now, talking about emotions, the thing that has people most upset about Skeleton Crew, because this is Star Wars after all, is the fact that some of the first scenes in the trailers show what looks like a suburban neighborhood with roads. I mean, a wealthy utopian suburb with cleanly robotic manicured lawns has to exist in a galaxy-wide civilization. Like, after you get over the initial shock of seeing an idealized version of your childhood, if you're thinking about it rationally, if there are planets with mile-high trees and sentient furry apes that are basically man's best friend, but with space crossbows, the suburbs are pretty mild in comparison, and maybe that is the criticism here that is more valid, that, hey, this is kind of boring, huh? The suburbs and Star Wars? Actually, I have something to say about that. I think I understand why they're doing this. But let's talk about that later. For me, the thing that really bothered me initially here when I saw this was the roads in the suburbs. I know it's petty, right? But I guess you can't have suburbs without roads. It's the whole reason why suburbs are kind of a luxury and too hard to sustain. In a city, you could have potentially thousands of people paying property taxes to maintain a mile of road, whereas in the suburbs, that number is closer to maybe 100 or so. That leads to either exorbitantly high property taxes, which if you're a homeowner, I'm sure you're experiencing right now, or just potholes and, roads falling apart everywhere that Domino's has to fill up. That or you have an HOA, which is literally my least favorite type of organization in the world. It's an organization that actively introduces you to your neighbors in the worst way possible and makes you think that they're all crazy and extremely petty people. And it makes you question your choice in living in that neighbor or that building. But with advances in technology in the Star Wars galaxy, like repulsor lifts, you would think that in the galactic suburbs, at least one of the most constantly annoying maintenance burdens for local citizens, the roads, would be unnecessary. Because if you take a look at this right here, these things float over the ground, right? That's what speeders do. They don't really need asphalt, right?
Roads? Where we're going, we don't need roads.
Well, it kind of depends. You see, speeders, the main in-atmosphere vehicle used by people to get around, can indeed fly in the air. Technically, they can fly in space. Most repulsor lifts work as long as they're pretty close to a planet with a lot of gravity. These are, after all, the same devices that power Star Destroyers in atmosphere, and those things are freaking huge. But here's the thing, while you can get away with flying around in your airspeeder in any direction in more, underpopulated regions of the Outer Rim, on more developed worlds like Coruscant or even Alderaan, there are going to be limitations to where you can fly and how you can fly and at what time you can fly, I'm sure. And that's simply because humans, most sentient beings in the galaxy, evolved on the ground, as in we're okay at navigating 2D spaces. Honestly, we're not even that good at doing that. And so, throwing us in a 3D environment, a very crowded 3D environment with other human beings and sentient beings who don't really know how to navigate in that way, well, that's just a recipe for disaster. You kind of need structure, and you can't just have a free-for-all. Also, rich people who pay for those high-floor penthouses in Coruscant really don't want you to be racing by on a speeder at 200 miles per hour just a few feet away from their dining room window. Yeah, that's totally not going to work. I mean, even in New York City, people have made it increasingly hard for helicopters to land next to residential buildings. Not only because they fear these helicopters crashing into their buildings. Actually, I don't think they are afraid of that at all. It's more about the freaking noise of a helicopter outside your window. I mean, that's kind of insane. And so on planets like Coruscant, you have what's known as the Coruscant Air Traffic Control Authority. They keep air traffic isolated in areas that are appropriate, away from pedestrian walkways, residential buildings, landmarks that people might want to kamikaze into, like the Jedi Temple or Imperial Taxation Bureau. Only emergency crews on emergency vehicles can really fly wherever they want, and even if they do that, they are probably trained and briefed on what they can or can't do. If they mess up, that's a big, PR disaster for that agency or organization. And in the suburbs, especially with a place like this in the Skeleton Crew, where everything looks completely perfect, you're definitely going to have the type of people who just don't like seeing other people have fun. Let's be honest about this, guys. I've lived in a suburb before. It just attracts these type of people for some reason. Even though repulsor lifts with their anti-gravity tech are a far more elegant flight solution than using wings to generate lift, they can still fail. And when something falls from the sky uncontrollably, it generally creates a lot of damage to the ground when it lands. And so these families living in these homes don't want people flying above their houses or, accidentally careening into their houses. It's basically the same reason why people in Coruscant don't want people flying everywhere. It's about safety and noise. If you take a look at most speeder vehicles in Star Wars, whether it's Mando Bro's speeder bike or Luke Skywalker's speeder in Episode 4, most people seem to prefer flying at ground levels, probably for the same reason. It's just more comfortable and safer to stay on the ground, in case anything should happen. And for there to be a lot of vehicles traveling around on the ground, you kind of have to mark the lanes in which people have to stay in. You have to have a physical barrier somewhat. And roads, they're not just for cars, they're also designed as visual reminders to pedestrians to not walk there, because death. That's why you have curbs. Curbs aren't meant to keep cars off of the sidewalk. If anything, it helps them kind of like leap onto the sidewalk, making them more deadly because they usually go airborne. Now, curbs are meant as a physical separation between where humans are walking and where humans are when they're driving. Curbs were invented long before there were even cars, and they were also created to manage rainwater runoff. And let's say you're walking around with your eyes glued to your phone, or if you're blind, when you step off a curb, you generally trip and you're alerted to where you are. So this is just the safety feature. And roads, whether your car is driving directly on them or your repulsor lift is floating above the asphalt, are kind of a social agreement made by the local community. We as civilized people decide to drive on or over them and not through Steve's backyard or through Bob's living room. Even though as much as a lot of us want to drive in a straight line directly to our destination, by inconveniencing ourselves and adhering to these physical lines that are drawn on the ground, we are getting one step closer to having a cohesive civilization. Roads connect each other, and they're a mutually agreed way of facilitating transport. And by having this road structure, you can then layer on a driving culture, a set of rules on how to drive, like, you shouldn't just drive on any side of the road. Everyone should keep to the right. That way you don't have head-on collisions. It's small things like this. What's even more interesting is that these roads in this scene seem to have guide rails etched into them. They kind of look like a single receded light rail line, or maybe something you would see in like a Disney ride. Which leads me to think that either these are lines used to provide power to the vehicles traveling on the road, or they are also guidelines for the vehicles to follow. Actually, if we take a close look at this scene here, you can see that the vehicle is tethered to this groove by something. Also, there seems to be droid attendants in the cockpit of school buses, perhaps a redundancy measure when you're, ferrying around a bunch of precious children. Now, we know that in Star Wars, there are droid-driven vehicles, which reduce the cost of transportation. But if you do have a integrated track in the road, which limits where your car can go, you don't really need droids or droid brains. You can have a much more simplified computer system that just basically drives you along the tracks and makes sure you don't run into other vehicles, something that's relatively easy to do. Heck, you could even do all of this remotely via some kind of central system that manages everything from afar. Now, this might be a more costly endeavor, especially initially when you're putting down all this infrastructure, but the long-term savings can be pretty good as well. I mean, it's actually not a terrible idea, but what you have as a result is a society where people really don't drive. People aren't held responsible for their driving, therefore there is no insurance or no insuring these individuals in their vehicles. There are also probably much less accidents and much less resources placed in keeping people safe. And yeah, again, this sounds absolutely horrible. And that's because I was born in a culture of motorcycles and cars, a culture in which those vehicles were directly linked to freedom. Something I'm sure the big automakers really appreciated and pushed along a little more, but it is true to a certain extent. Having a car is a huge deal in American society, or at least it was. What if you weren't from a car culture? What if the idea of getting your license sounds difficult? What if driving seems like a terrifying prospect? I think this has always been true for a certain percentage of the population. I mean, if you take a look at the new generation, there's less and less gearheads than ever before. Now, this also has to do with how technology is changing, with EV cars slowly gaining market share, with their more simplified components, less noise, and direct maintenance. It seems like the future trajectory of a car is to become more like an appliance, a computer on wheels. In a lot of Asian countries, it's kind of already like that. No one really cares about horsepower or like the aesthetics outside so much as they care about what kind of software they have inside the vehicle. Can you do karaoke? Can you play video games while you're driving, or while the AI assistant is driving for you? And it's kind of sad because it used to be a rite of passage and a huge deal when you got your provincial license at 16 years old. They'd open the world for young teenagers, to go out and explore. It allowed you to go see your friends when you wanted, visit areas in your state that you've never been. And for the first time in your life, you weren't really dependent on your parents ferrying you around. This is why Americans, especially in rural and suburban areas, love cars and have this culture of cars surrounding them, because we really do associate freedom with these vehicles, because that is what they gave us in high school. But now you have services like Uber and Lyft where it no longer becomes necessary for everyone to have a license or car. You have more migration to cities and urban areas where public transportation is great and much cheaper. And so if you take a look at statistics from the Federal Highway Administration, in the age group of 16 to 19 in 1995, about 64% of those kids had driver's licenses. And now in 2021, or it was 2021, only 40% of those same kids in that age group have licenses. That's a pretty big drop. I imagine when fully automatic cars become a thing, that number will drop even more. And people who love cars will still want to drive them, including new generations of, gearheads. There still will be them, even though if they are going to be in smaller numbers. But then again, that's only if they allow us to drive still, because as the pool of insured drivers gets smaller and smaller, it might be harder for insurance companies to actually exist and still make money off of that model. Maybe insurance premiums will be really high and it'll be a luxury to drive your own car. And so, yeah, I think this is definitely quite realistic for a society to have a completely automated road system, like what we see in Minority Reports. I also think in our own world, this is really the only way we can actually have automated driving. You need to build infrastructure on the roads like these rails to guide the cars along so that they aren't wholly reliable on sensor data or cameras or LiDAR. Now, from a plot point of view, I actually think this is kind of cool that they've introduced things like roads in the suburbs, because, yeah, it's supposed to make us feel comfortable at home, bring out nostalgia. It's supposed to make younger audiences relate to these characters who kind of grow up in a very similar environment that they are growing up in today. What will be far more interesting is the stark contrast between their cozy utopia suburban home planet and the more dangerous planets they adventure on. Going from a world where you literally are on Tomorrowland Speedway to freely exploring some rugged pirate hideout. And this really is in the spirit of Star Wars. I feel like George Lucas created the original Star Wars as kind of encouragement to younger generations to leave the house, embrace adventure, start your life out. And so there's really no better way to start a Star Wars movie starring kids that's actually for adults than having them start in basically the quintessential American suburb in the 1990s, 2000s, whatever year you grew up in. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome coverage. The Skeleton Crew, which comes out, I think, tonight, right? Oh, yeah, stick here. We'll be covering more stuff about the lore behind the scenes, breaking down stuff. I really do hope this one's going to be good. Well, guys, I'll see you next time. My name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy.